everybody, let's talk about the social self. In this particular video, we'll talk about the self-concept, we'll discuss some of the basics, and we'll talk also about introspection and affective forecasting. What are we talking about when we talk about this whole sense of self? It's something that's really important to us. It's something that we cling to. We are social animals, but we have this important concept of individuality and our self-concept. Think about it, we spend a lot of times contemplating ourselves, a lot of times just sitting there thinking about ourselves and our situations. In other words, we spend a lot of time self-reflecting, and that's really needed to understand who we are, our motives, our emotions, our behaviors. Haven't you ever been in a situation where you ask yourself, why did I do that? You acted some particular way, and thinking back, you wish you didn't, and you're thinking, why did I do that? Maybe you're feeling some way that you don't understand and you're wondering why you're feeling that way. It's really pretty interesting to see that we don't completely understand ourselves, but one way that we try to understand ourselves is by self-reflecting. We understand that we are different from other people. That's one basis for a self-concept. And it's also interesting to see that that's not something that we're just necessarily born with. It takes time to develop. We'll talk about that soon. The whole idea of like self-recognition, understanding that we are separate people from others. All these things contribute to our sense of self. Let's talk about some of the other things that contribute to a sense of self. One of the key things is how we see our relationships with others. Most of all, we're really defined by those relationships. So for example, if you asked me, who are you, Frank? One of the first things I would say is I'm a stepfather. My role in that capacity is very important to me. The family is very important to me. It defines who I am, my sense of self. Just going along with that similar thinking, I'm an uncle. That little guy right there is Levi. I'm actually a great uncle to him. And he's going to need some help walking as he grows up and moving around. So I actually built that little wheelchair, that little mobility device for him. So again, these are things that are really important to me. When I think about who I am, that picture comes into my mind. I think about I'm the kind of guy who really values family. I'm the kind of guy who would build something like that for my nephew. So the relationships that I have are very important in defining who I am. How we think others view us is an important component about how we view ourselves. So we're often trying to manage, self-present who we are to other people. How, of course, we want to be seen by others is another important component of our self-concept. As I mentioned, we can manage who we are, and the activities that we engage in will very much define who we are, because that defines how others will see us. As with most things in psychology, we can think about the ABCs. And when we think about the ABCs of the self, you want to think about A always as affect. And here we're talking about how you feel about yourself. And that's what self-esteem is all about. So in this chapter, we'll talk about that. B is always the behavioral component. I mentioned that we manage and regulate who we are. So we'll talk about that in this chapter as well. And then, of course, there's always C, a cognitive component in psychology. And there's a cognitive component about the self, how you think about yourself, the different attitudes that you have regarding yourself, how you maintain your self-identity. Let's talk about that next. We'll focus on that cognitive component. And that brings us to a discussion of the self-concept. Let's talk about the self-concept. What is it? It's really just a set of beliefs that we have about our own personal attributes. And of course, beliefs represent that whole cognitive capacity, what we're thinking. The self-concept then is composed of a variety of these beliefs, of course, and we call those self-schemas. What self-schemas are essentially little mini self-concepts. They consist of specific beliefs that we have about ourselves, and these specific beliefs, these self-schemas, guide our behavior and our information processing. The self is really a very important cognitive structure because it's always front and center. Like I said, we spend a lot of time thinking about ourselves. Well, all information that comes in is essentially filtered through that self-concept. And it, of course, flavors the way that we see things. It colors the way that we view things. In other words, we're never very far from our own thoughts. Let's talk a little bit more about these self-schemas. we might say that we are schematic for certain things. And when we're schematic for certain things, it means that those particular things really define who we are. So, for example, they not only represent a lot of thoughts that we have about ourselves, but they also represent how we view others. So, for example, intelligence is very important to me. So, not only am I thinking about my own intelligence and how I can foster that and make it better, I'm thinking about intelligence in other people. So, someone like Albert Einstein obviously would be very important to me, and I think he's got a lot of really important things to share. So, we might say that intelligence is chronically accessible for me because I'm thinking about it a lot in terms of how it defines who I am, but I'm also thinking about it a lot in terms of how it defines other people. So, of course, I'm all around students, and I'm always thinking about their intelligence and how I can foster their intelligence and their natural intelligence. And I find it really exciting when I meet students who are much more brilliant than I am. In other words, it's chronically accessible. I'm always thinking about it. It's coloring my view of everything that I encounter in this world. But now, of course, there are some things that I am aschematic on. That simply means not so schematic. And something like fashion, I don't really think about that much. And Albert Einstein, from all the pictures that I've ever seen, is a fashion misfit. So I don't really care about his hair. I'm not even seeing that when I look at these pictures. I'm just thinking to myself, what is he thinking right now? What could he teach me? So we're schematic for a variety of things that are very important to us, and aschematic for things that are not so defining. So just to go over another couple quick examples, I would assume that you as a student have a schema that's very strong about school. So, you're interested in books, you're interested in learning more, you want to get as much information as you can about your intended profession, you want to be around other people who are smart and are also going into that profession. And then, of course, there are some things that are not nearly as important to you, and we'd say that those are items that you are aschematic on. Those are things you don't think about very much. You don't judge people on those issues. Let's talk about an interesting issue, because whenever we're talking about something cognitive like the self, we have to wonder how it relates to the brain. And you might ask yourself, is the self represented somewhere specifically in the brain? Well, if you think about it this way, I think it helps. The mind is what the brain does. The brain is an organ. It's processing information via neural activity. And that neural activity provides us with a consciousness, and that's where we live, that's where we think, and that's where we have that sense of self. So the self really does, of course, reside in our mind. And that means the self, of course, is represented in the brain, because that's, of course, where self-based processing occurs. Now, there are some specific regions of the brain that tend to be involved in self-based processing. So when we're thinking about ourselves, when we're contemplating trait terms, for example, that are related to us, we see some brain regions that are more active. And we can see that through research with PET scans, fMRI scans, things like that. Now, we understand, of course, that the self really influences mental processing, things like memory. I mean, we know that the self has a huge influence on our brain and our mental processing. The self-reference effect is one of the best ways to demonstrate that. If you try to remember and process information just in and of itself, you'll only do so well. But if you take that information and you try to make it meaningful to yourself, you can remember it and process that information in much more depth. We call it the self-reference effect. So that's why your instructors are often telling you, try to make the course material meaningful to you, because if you make it more meaningful to you, it's much more easy to remember and understand that information. So the self, of course, guides processing, and processing occurs in the brain. So we're trying to talk about here just how the self is represented in the brain. Now, it's not exactly clear, of course, where in the brain, because we can't typically, for almost anything, point to one section of the brain and say that's where we process that information. So although there are some brain regions that seem to be more related to self-processing, and although it's tough to really define how the brain activity creates the sense of self that we have, we do know that the sense of self can be very much transformed when there's brain damage. Let me just talk about a couple examples of that. You might recall learning in your intro psych class about Phineas Gage, and he was a railroad worker, and there was an explosion that took a steel rod and it blew it right through his face and through his head, and it injured his frontal lobe and caused obviously some serious problems. And after that, he was essentially never the same. His personality and his sense of self really changed. People who knew him would say, he's just not Gage anymore. He's not the guy who we knew. Now that's an old story, but we see this stuff daily in our current lives. We hear a lot today about TBI, traumatic brain injury, and TBI can lead to all kinds of negative symptoms like confusion, memory loss, mood changes, agitation, poor judgment, inappropriate social behavior. Well, here we're talking about a lot of the things that define who you are. They define your personality. They define your sense of self. So we can see, of course, that damage to the brain is going to damage one's current sense of self. And there are some really interesting videos out there. This one in particular was created by the Washington Post. It's essentially a video report. It's called Coming Home a Different Person. And it looks at some military personnel who suffered brain damage. And they are not the same people that they were previously. Now, of course, they do their best, and they often are living amazing, happy lives. But in almost every situation, they realize that their sense of self has changed. Let's switch gears just a little bit. Let's talk about self-recognition. Even when we look back at this previous slide, this gentleman, of course, has a horrible brain injury. We can see that just by looking. But see, now he's looking in the mirror. He's working on his haircut. He still recognizes who he is. Let's talk about that for a second, because that's really the basis for one's self-identity. So let's ask this question: do animals recognize themselves? We've seen this situation probably several times where a dog is essentially starting a fight with himself in the mirror. And dogs in general, from what we understand, don't have self-recognition. That dog is not looking at himself and admiring his smile. He's looking at the mirror and noticing what seems to be another dog, although he's not smelling this dog. He knows something's different, but he is not seeing himself in that mirror. Without self-recognition, there really can be no sense of self. Without understanding that you are this unique person separate from others, there can really be no self-concept. And this leads to a lot of fascinating research. And what's kind of interesting is that the mirror serves as a really important research tool. So look at this baby right here. I mean, this is a relatively newborn baby, very young. This baby at this point does not have a sense of self like we know it. This baby does not have self-recognition. So the baby's looking in the mirror, and the baby can see him or herself, but doesn't really understand what's going on. Now, how do we know this? There's been a lot of really neat research. Let's say we take this baby and we put him around a mirror pretty often. So the kid kind of gets used to what he or she is seeing. And then imagine if at some point we put the baby in front of a mirror with a dot painted on his or her forehead. If the baby is understanding that the reflection in the mirror is me, then the baby's going to look at that dot, maybe touch at that dot and think like, what's wrong? There's something wrong with me. That's not how I looked, the last time I looked in this mirror. And of course, babies aren't able to process that type of information. But it doesn't take long. Kids achieve self-recognition by about 1.5 years, 2 years old. The child in this picture clearly knows that that's me in the mirror. And let's say she was just eating spaghetti and she had that all over her face. She'd be able to look at that mirror and say like, oh my God, there's something on my face. Mom, you need to wash my face. I have spaghetti all over my face. She'd understand that that's me. Well, the point I'm trying to make is self-recognition is really the basis for having a sense of self. And it's really neat to look at some of this research. So we're talking about animals. There are a variety of animals that do have a sense of self. They are able to recognize themselves, specifically great apes. So we're talking about chimps, gorillas, orangutans. They are put through that type of test with mirrors. They look at the mirror like you're looking at this gorilla right here. He sees himself in a mirror. They put him in a situation, in an environment where they see this for a while. They get used to it. They look at the mirror and they start grooming themselves. They're using it as a tool. And then at some point, this gorilla might come back with a red dot on his head. And then when he sees that red dot in the mirror, immediately touches it and thinks like, what's wrong? What is this that's on my head? I mean, I'd be horrified if I woke up and I found something that different about my face. And that's because I know who I am and I know what I look like. I recognize myself. I recognize myself and I see that I'm different from others. Of course, there are some other animals that have self-recognition, and via research, researchers have found that dolphins, elephants, they probably have self-recognition as well. Are there other animals that have self-recognition? Almost certainly. Like not all animals have been tested. It raises some interesting issues. I've often thought about what it would be like to have a world without mirrors. We spend so much time in our society looking at ourselves in the mirror that we become somewhat obsessed with ourselves and with appearances. I just wonder how things would be if mirrors didn't exist. I mean, when I think about myself, I have a picture in my mind. As I'm even talking about myself right now, I'm seeing that picture. Yet, of course, I can't see myself as I'm speaking right now, but in my mind is that mirror image. Let's talk a little bit how we measure the self-concept. Sometimes it seems like it should be just really straightforward. I mean, we can simply ask ourselves about our beliefs, our attitudes, our emotions, our motivations. If you want to know about me and how I define myself, just ask me. And of course, that's the basis for much of the research. So through formal interviews, survey research, we are assessing people's self-concept. And let me just give you one example. This really simple but really telling test is called the 20 statements test. And in this situation, I would just give you essentially a piece of paper, and I would ask you to respond 20 times over to just simply complete the sentence, I am blank. So just do your best to complete that sentence 20 times, I am blank. And what we find is that the first item that people list is often really telling and really defining of their self-concept. Those items tend to be chronically accessible. They are items, traits that people are always thinking about. They're very important to who they are. They evaluate other people based on those dimensions. Some of the things that I've encountered via reading and then also just working with students, things that I see over and over again, like when people are parents, they might say that I am a mom. I am a good mom, something like that. It really defines who they are. Often with race, there are interesting patterns as well. I will often notice with Black women that the first thing they will put is, I am a Black woman. It's just chronically accessible. It is something that really defines who that person is. And of course, her entire life at that point is filtered through that lens. Race, of course, in our culture is something that's like highly charged and very accessible to a lot of people. Now, there are problems, though, of course, with just asking people about themselves. And we call that introspection, by the way. Introspection is just looking in. I'm going to ask you about yourself, and then you're going to look in and tell me how you feel, tell me how you think. That can be somewhat unreliable. It can be unreliable for a variety of reasons. One reason is that we're often motivated to make ourselves look good to others. We're motivated to make ourselves look good to ourselves. So we often overestimate some of the positive qualities that we have when we start talking about our own self-concept and how we see ourselves. We often find via this research that people's stated attitudes and their behaviors don't really correlate, so you can see that there's something wrong. So, for example, some students might talk about how intelligence and education and success are so important to who they are, and they define their self-concept, yet they're not spending nearly enough time studying. We can see that they're undermining their education. So there's this discrepancy between how they're defining their self-concept and what they're actually doing with their behaviors. There are people who might say that family is so important to them. It's the most important thing. It's how they define themselves. Yet they spend much more time and energy at work. You see what I'm getting at? Sometimes people's stated attitudes, their beliefs about themselves don't really correlate well with their behaviors. So introspection, relying on self-reports, can sometimes lead to some problems. We also see a lot of problems with what we call affective forecasting. Remember, affect is all about emotion. So here we're talking about forecasting your emotions, forecasting how you would feel. So predicting your feelings into the future. So again, I'm just trying to make the point that we can't always rely on people to just simply tell us how they feel. In these situations when I'm talking about affective forecasting, we'll often ask people how they might feel if they're involved in like some type of horrific accident. Like what if you were to lose your sight? How would you feel about yourself, and how would you feel about your life? And people often think that it would be horrible and they would hate life. They wouldn't even want to live. But when you do research with people who have gone through that type of situation, you typically find that at some point they come back to about their same level of happiness. They deal with it, they cope. People often underestimate the coping mechanisms that they have. Another thing that I think is very interesting that comes from affective forecasting is just to look at like teens, troubled teens particularly. And they're often thinking to themselves that, at least, like some segment of this group is thinking to themselves that my life would be so much better if I had a baby. If I just had a little baby that I can care for and a baby that loved me, everything would be great. And I think we all know that's often not the answer for a troubled teen. But you see how they're having a hard time predicting how they would feel in the future? So it really helps us understand that we might not know ourselves, as well as we think we know ourselves. And of course, that really is a problem if we're trying to assess the self-concept, because the self-concept is all about who are you. Let's talk just a little bit more about measuring the self-concept. As I mentioned, we don't know ourselves as well as we think we do, so we have to kind of accept that we don't always have privileged access to our thoughts and feelings. And that might be hard for some people to understand, for some people to swallow. You might think, hey, no one knows me better than I know me. And that's probably true, but that doesn't mean that you completely know who you are. You do not have privileged access into all the contents of your mind. We don't always know why we do the things that we do. Well, we need to recognize that. And if we recognize that when it comes to research on the self, we will recognize that self-report measures have some limited value. Let me just give you a real quick example of another type of measurement that has been really very helpful, and that would be reaction time measures. So one thing that we've learned is that people will respond very quickly to items that define who they are, items that define their sense of self. So we can create a situation where, like using a computer, for example, people are going to respond as quickly as they can to a question. Like, do you believe that the following trait describes you? And I'm about to put a trait term on the screen, and the people are trained to use one of two buttons on the computer to respond yes or no. So for example, something might pop up, the word kind, and again, I'm asked to respond as quickly as possible if this trait describes me. And let's say I am kind. And I think to myself, oh yes, I'm kind. I see myself as kind. Other people see me as kind. I help people every chance I get. I help puppies every chance I get. I am a kind person. That person is going to be able to respond yes very quickly because there's no doubt in that person's mind. But now let's say the next trait term that comes up is something like outgoing. And now that person again needs to respond as quickly as possible. But the person's saying like, well, yes, I'm outgoing. I like people, but sometimes I'm kind of uncomfortable around crowds, and sometimes I really do value my alone time, and boy, some other people seem a lot more outgoing than I am. And I'm not saying they're thinking about it that deliberately, but all that goes through their mind before they decide what button they're going to press. And now the person might press the button saying, yes, I'm outgoing, but they've responded somewhat more slowly. So all I'm trying to tell you is there are different ways we can measure the contents of someone's self-concept, and reaction time measures provide one way. All right, everybody, that's it for this section, but stay tuned because there's much more social psychology coming up soon.